Sexuality is an integral part of how we live and who we are as human beings. And sexuality doesn't just necessarily mean penetrative intercourse. Forget about reproduction. Even as far as sex goes, the act of coitus isn't the only component to it. So we're talking about touch, we're talking about intimacy, we're talking about conversations, we're talking about creating safe spaces for each other as partners. And unfortunately or fortunately, we are at a point in time where there is a lot of shame, a lot of taboo, a lot of lack of conversation around. The acceptance of polyamorous women has increased over the last decade and a half. Also, I live in a network of people where sexual awareness is generally high. So, part of my response is also coming from that mindset because people are already in tune with their desires. People are in tune with um, what they want, what they don't want, how to express themselves in the bedroom and outside of it in a relationship. It becomes a little easier there to get accepted as a polywoman. The second thing to understand here is that this question is necessarily not of polyamory, but more of what we might call feminism. As controversial as it might sound, this is about gender equality.
Hi, welcome to the Mohua Show. My name is Mohua Chinappa and I am an author, entrepreneur, and ex housewife. This podcast is about everything from business to technology to arts to lifestyle, but done and spoken ईमानदारी से. Hi, in today's episode, we have with us Anupama once again. Anupama embodies a dynamic spirit, constantly evolving. So, obviously, this time it's going to be a new conversation that we are going to have. She upholds values of honesty, communication, kindness, and as a pioneering writer, she bravely delves into nonfiction about kink, BDSM, and alternate lifestyles in India, which isn't easy as a woman. She has addressed societal taboos with courage. With over a decade exploring sexuality, mental health, and social issues, she advocates against shaming, asserting her beliefs with integrity. Writing in Hindi for broader reach, she aims to foster sexual awareness authentically. Her resolve to live truth, Her resolve to live truthfully is evident, balancing transparency with safety, shaping her narrative with resilience and unwavering conviction. Welcome, Anupama, in today's episode.
Thank you for having me, Mawa, and hi to everybody who's listening to Mawa on our show.
सो अनु लेट्स जस्ट बिगिन ये तो दूसरा सेकंड है हमारी इंटरव्यू पहला वाला में भी मैं बहुत इम्प्रेस थी आपके काम के साथ और आप जैसे इंसान हो और नॉन फिक्शन वर्क ऐसे स्पेस में जो इतना ज्यादा बिल्कुल भी नहीं कोई अंडरस्टैंडिंग है how has it been your inward journey into exploring human sexual behavior and alternative lifestyles, given that societal narrative always restricts sexuality to only reproduction. I mean, a woman is allowed to enjoy sex only because she's not allowed to enjoy sex. You have sex to produce children.
So, let me begin this by saying sexuality is not a rather let me say this sexuality is an integral part of how we live and who we are as human beings. And sexuality doesn't just necessarily mean penetrative intercourse. Forget about reproduction. Even as far as sex goes, the act of coitus isn't the only component to it. So we're talking about touch, we're talking about intimacy, we're talking about conversations, we're talking about creating safe spaces for each other as partners. And unfortunately or fortunately, we are at a point in time where there is a lot of shame, a lot of taboo, a lot of lack of conversation around. And like you rightly said, a woman is expected to have sex with her partner, not necessarily enjoy it, but do engage in a coitus or engage in an intercourse with her partner in order to reproduce. The expectation as defined is similar for a man. It's also, if you look at some of the religious cults and if you look at some of these spiritual practices, they would say similar things for men. But the societal acceptance of a man not following those norms is higher than a woman not following those norms. So it hasn't been easy. The inward journey that you spoke about, that you asked about, it hasn't been easy. It's been difficult. It's been very uncomfortable because you're raised as a good girl, quote unquote, who's expected to be a virgin till they marry, and then they're expected to marry and have children and have family in the conventional way we define family. हम दो हमारे दो, और वो हम दो भी हेट्रोसेक्सुअल हेट्रोनॉर्मेटिव कपल होना चाहिए, ये एक्सपेक्टेशन है। और ये बहुत डीपली कंडीशनड है क्योंकि आपके पेरेंट्स मोनोगेमस हैं, आपके रिलेटिव्स मोनोगेमस हैं, आपके फ्रेंड्स मोनोगेमस हैं, एवरीबडी अराउंड यू इज मोनोगेमस, एंड सो दैट एक्सपेक्टेशन इज देयर। एट द सेम टाइम there is this curiosity, and then the curiosity has taken me into trying stuff, experimenting with stuff, observing stuff, talking to people, and it's been difficult to reconcile the two, because clearly when you see people who are deriving pleasure or who are even chasing pleasure for that matter, they're not unhappy. On the contrary, when you see people fulfilling the societal norms, a lot of them are visibly unhappy. Now, the reason could be the number. One could say, oh, because a lot of people do follow the norms, so the lot of number of unhappy people will also be higher because that's the majority. But my question then to myself was, do I want happiness? Do I want pleasure? Do I want contentment? And if any or all of these, at what cost do I want it? So that defining of that cost has been the primary challenge. Do I want to pay the cost of being potentially ostracized by the community that I live in? Do I want to pay the cost of living a dual life? It's a possibility. That's an option that I had, to live a duplicit life and to keep living that life. Do I want the possibility where I am one fine day suddenly discovered by a husband if I get married, and then have to explain to everybody why I was cheating on someone? Did I want to take that option up? So those were some of the questions that I asked for myself during my journey, and finding answers to them on one hand wasn't easy. On the other hand, they made me discover myself to a point where I could find courage enough to be authentic and say openly that, okay, this is who I am. This is how I want to be in my life. And I might have to lose out on a few close relationships, say, supposedly, hypothetically, family, say a couple of friends. And then I also reached a point eventually through this inward journey where I said, okay, now I think it doesn't matter. If people are going to stay with me, they're going to stay with me, but I'm going to live my truth. So, A, it hasn't been easy. B, it's been fulfilling regardless. So, I'm not sure if that answers the question, but yeah, that's what the journey's been like.
Which is very, very large, Anupama. I think, for us sitting outside your own journey, it's very difficult, but definitely a very, very brave and a courageous inward journey, must admit. Very few of us also are willing to even address these questions. We try to brush that under the carpet, and we don't want to come to terms with our own sexuality, over years on end. And like you rightly said, that many people follow the norms and die unhappy. So let's just dive into the concept of polyamory. ये मेरे को समझ तो नहीं आती है. How does it differ from a traditional monogamous relationship in modern lifestyle settings? और बहुत ज्यादा हम पढ़ रहे हैं कि लोग बात कर रहे हैं polyamory के बारे, और इसमें honesty कैसा रहता है?
So see, one of the things that most people need to that I usually want most people to understand when I'm talking to them is that monogamy or monoamory or polygamy or polyamory are as good or as not good as the people involved. आप जितने ईमानदार मोनोगमी में हैं, आप उतने ही ईमानदार पॉलीआमरी में भी हो सकते हैं. उसमें टाइम ज्यादा लगेगा बिकॉज रिलेशनशिप ज्यादा हैं, देयर आर मोर पीपल. Think of it like living in a nuclear family versus living in a joint family. If you're living in a joint family, there are more relationships to navigate on a day to day basis. If you're living in a nuclear family, then it's only you and your spouse and probably your children. So the number of relationships increases, but the honesty or the ethics are something that are integral to you as a human being. And that's a choice. That's always a choice because either you are honest or you're not honest. ये वो honesty is one place जहाँ पे ना कोई ग्रे एरिया नहीं होता है. या तो आप ईमानदार हैं या तो आप ईमानदार नहीं हैं. या तो आपने अपने पार्टनर को बताया है कि मुझे एक से ज्यादा लोग पसंद है, या तो आपने अपने पार्टनर को नहीं बताया गया. और ये
पर
कंफ्यूजन
अनुपमा,
भी कभी नहीं होता.
पार्टनर तो हर्ट होता है ना.
सॉरी.
अनुपमा, इसमें एक पार्टनर तो हर्ट होता है, बिकॉज वन पार्टनर इज गोइंग टू बी हर्ट इफ देयर इज अ if that person is not willing to accept polyamory. So
That depends.
like you
So
rightly said, that imandari and honesty is really a personal choice, or a value in life. But I was just wondering that many times maybe if the other partner is not okay about you going out, and you've got that innate desire of wanting to experiment with multiple relationships, how does that work?
So that depends, Moa. That's a very subjective, like people will have very subjective responses to it. It depends on when did you discover polyamory. Did you discover while you were still single? Because if you discovered it while you were still single, it's going to be a little easier in the sense that you can tell people that if poly doesn't work for you, then you and I are not compatible. Then I look at it merely as a compatibility factor. If you've already married, if you've already partnered, and then you end up discovering poly, then it may be a little tricky. I have seen couples successfully navigate poly even after being in monogamous relationships. It's not been easy for them. There's been a lot of conversation, there's been a lot of coaxing, cajoling, initially lying and cheating, and then getting discovered, and then talking about it, and then processing. All of that has happened. I've also seen couples fall apart and part ways from each other because at some point they realized that it wasn't working for them any longer. And so, okay, so if it doesn't work, then let's part. And I've also seen couples who will, for whatever societal reasons of their own, they will stay in those relationships. They will keep fighting each other. They will keep spreading the toxicity in the family. And yet, they would neither accept nor move away. So I've seen all three dimensions of it. And I think hurt hona is again a personal choice. You can try and understand what the other partner is going through. Like, okay, let me give you this example. So, a very close friend who was polyamorous was with a person who was non poly. The guy was poly, the girl was not poly. Now, one fine day, the guy goes and meets another woman because he's poly. The girl knows that she's poly, but the girl is expecting that now he's with me, he's exclusive to me. That's an expectation that she has. And he comes back and he tells her, hey, you know what? I went and met this girl. And now she's heartbroken. And she ended up calling me and she was like, we need to sit and drink. And I was like, and what are we drinking to? And she said, we're drinking to my heartbreak. She told me the story. My question to her was, you have three choices. As your friend, I can say the guy's a douche, dump him now. As his friend, I can try and defend him and justify his actions. Or, as a neutral party, who's a friend to both of you, who will still choose you over him, but I can give you a third option. Why don't you explore some of the online platforms? Why don't you meet some people in the community? And why don't you try and understand how different people operate in such relationships? You do not have to necessarily go and be polyamorous yourself. If it still doesn't work, it doesn't work. We'll figure out. But let's try and understand. So I think that willingness to understand is the first step. The ability to understand is the next step. The ability is not the concern. The willingness is the concern. Are you willing to listen to your partner? And if that
Oh,
happens, then the hurt automatically reduces.
this is so deep because you know what, that willingness to listen, I think between two partners can be so, such a gray area because one is caught up with their own upbringing, the traditional values, how is it that culture of where the kind of culture you come from, the society you belong to. So, just for our listeners, can you just explain the different types of polygamy, such as polygyny, polyandry, and group marriage, and their prevalence in different cultures?
So there's polyamory, which is having multiple lovers. This is gender neutral conceptually. Polygyny is when you have one man and multiple women. Polyandry is a situation where you have one woman with multiple men. A group marriage is more like where everybody is sexually or amorously or in a love romantic sense of it, everybody is involved with everybody. Now, one thing that I want to sort of share with the listeners and the viewers is that at the end of the day, these are all labels. They are designed in order so that we can communicate about them with ease, but they're not set in stone. How your couple or throuple or a group or a polycule, like we call it, how that functions is entirely up to the people involved in it. Some polycules will have a power dynamic involved. Some polycules will be hierarchical. Some polycules will be anarchical in structure in the sense that every partner is treated as equal. Some people will be like me, who are solo poly, who are independent, who do not have a nesting partner. I do not live with someone. I'm not married to someone. I do not have children or a house that I share with someone. And at the same time, all my partners know that I'm poly. They may not know each other, but that's a choice that they have. If they want to know each other, I'm happy to introduce and I'm happy to sort of invite them all to a big party. I don't mind. But that's a choice again that I will have to give to them because it's also about their comfort. It's not just about what I want. So poly is not about,
How do you,
yeah, sorry, you were saying
how do you
something.
navigate the insecurity? There will be insecurity, right, with the other partners involved. How do you navigate that, Anupama?
So the first thing that I tell people when they want to be in a relationship with me as a poly person, irrespective of whether they themselves are polyamorous or not, sometimes it also happens that the other person's a monogamous person and they want to be with me, irrespective of the fact that I will be with other people. The first thing to ask them is, would you be jealous if this was a monogamous relationship? Because if you're insecure as a person, then you're insecure as a person. So you could get insecure just because I spoke to my best friend over the phone. You could be insecure because, oh, my best friend happens to be a guy. So, that's one question to ask. Am I insecure as a person? Is my partner insecure as a person? The second thing to ask is this insecurity coming from the fact that your needs are not being met? Or is it simply coming from the fact that somebody else exists? These two are different things. You're my friend, I talk to you. It doesn't mean my mother doesn't get to talk to me. My mother's needs are still met. My father's needs are still met despite the fact that I have supposedly five boyfriends. There's nothing stopping me from having a great conversation with my father or my sibling. So if your needs are being addressed, and if the insecurity is coming simply from the function of, oh, there's another person, then one needs to question oneself and say, how does that matter? They're just another person in my family. They're just another person who I've chosen as family. And if the need is coming from a place, so sometimes people are married and the need and the insecurity comes from a place of, ये मुझे डंप तो नहीं कर देगा, फिर मेरा क्या होगा, या बच्चों का क्या होगा. And if there are questions like those, then you need to discuss logistics. Then those are logistical questions. Okay, so you want to go and see other people. What are the boundaries that we are going to draw? What are the limits that we are going
Yes.
to define for each other? So that becomes so. When you ask me how to navigate, the key still lies in communication. The question is how to communicate and what to talk about. So, some of the things to talk about are, what are my needs? What do I want from my partner? If I want exclusivity, then I have to be very clear in my head that I want exclusivity. Is it sexual exclusivity I want? Is it emotional exclusivity I want? Is it social exclusivity I want? Some people are okay with you having a sidekick or a second partner. Sidekick is offensive in language, I know, but that's what most people go about calling their paramours. So some people are okay with it as long as मेरे को तेरी वाइफ रहना है पार्टी में तेरे साथ मैं दिखनी चाहिए you go and sleep around with her. But that's not poly necessarily. That may be poly for the husband, but is it ethical? Now again, that's a subjective question. Is the husband telling the second partner or the third partner that I'm married and I have other people? So if that communication is transparent, if that communication is open, then it becomes easier to navigate jealousy, then it becomes easier to navigate insecurity and get everybody's needs addressed.
So, Anupama, you know what? I am just so intrigued in asking this question that this mainly is with men, that when they are married, they will go be seen with their wives in parties and they'll have multiple partners. But if their wives are doing the same thing, I don't know how many Indian men will be willing to accept this entire dynamic in the relationship. So, how does this work? I mean, because you have been doing so much of work, can you just share your insight on this?
So there are two things to it. One is changing a little. The acceptance of polyamorous women has increased over the last decade and a half. Also, I live in a network of people where sexual awareness is generally high. So part of my response is also coming from that mindset because people are already in tune with their desires. People are in tune with um, what they want, what they don't want, how to express themselves in the bedroom and outside of it in a relationship. It becomes a little easier there to get accepted as a poly woman. The second thing to understand here is that this question is necessarily not of polyamory, but more of what we might call feminism. As controversial as it might sound, this is about gender equality. This is about a societal expectation of how a man should be and how a woman should be. So, yes, a lot of men especially find it very difficult, but the same goes for a lot of women as well. Men's insecurity is that people will the difference in the insecurity is something subtle and funny because I find it funny. Women for instance are insecure about मेरे बच्चों का क्या होगा, मेरा क्या होगा, future का क्या होगा, am I not good enough? Men's insecurity is also coming from am I not good enough, but not because मेरा क्या होगा, मेरे परिवार का क्या होगा, मेरी बीवी का क्या होगा या बच्चों का क्या होगा, but because लोग सोचेंगे कि I'm not a man enough. The woman doesn't wonder about I'm not a woman enough. She believes I'm not a partner enough. The man thinks I'm not a man enough. And that's where the very fine, nuanced, subtle difference lies. So the man is not keen on protecting the family or protecting himself. He is more keen on protecting the image of the macho man that he is expected to live up to. The woman, on the other hand, has logistical concerns, and a lot of women, because we don't have as many working women as we have working men, that disparity, that vanilla situation, all of us are already aware of. So women's dependence is also financial. Men's dependence is purely societal. It's purely about the image that I have to project. Like if more women were earning, if more women had money of their own, probably their ability to stay single and then not marry and then have multiple partners would also increase. If
Do you
women
think
did
society
not
is
have,
moving? Do you
do I
feel
think society is
society is moving that way?
in certain sections of the society, yes. In certain other
Okay.
sections of the society, maybe not so much. That also brings in connotations of the class difference, the caste system, which is still prevalent despite it not being legal anymore. There are a lot of social, uh, how do I say, there's a lot of intersectionality in sexuality in that sense, how people express consent or lack of it, how their consent may be manipulated, coerced, depending on what social strata of the society they come from. So it's changing, certainly. But then again, I would be wrong to say that it's changing everywhere uniformly. Also, India is a very large country, Moa, and um, we have like so many layers of culture, of traditions, of local dialect, of language, of practices, that it is very difficult for us to say, oh, you know, 1.3 billion people are moving at the same pace. No, they're not. So in the echo chamber that we live in the online communities that we see, in the offline events that we do, in the people that we meet, despite the toxic misogyny, despite everything else, there is a lot of shift. On the other hand, if I were to go to a village, I would still see a lot of women struggling. If I were to look at probably see the segment where my domestic help comes from, that might not be true. There's still the questions of your roti kapra makan take precedence over whether I want to be poly or whether I want to be mono. You know what I'm saying, right? I'm sorry if I'm sounding like an activist, but
How did you first become interested in exploring BDSM? And just for our listeners, BDSM full form is bondage, discipline, dominance, submission, sadism, machoism. And what drew you to this area of human sexuality?
so that was an accidental discovery, Mahua. I had moved to Delhi. This was 2006. I was 22. I had broken up with a guy who I was in a long distance relationship with. And one of my colleagues, an elder woman, like somebody who was almost 10 years older to me, she thought it was a great idea to introduce me to porn because she thought masturbation might help. She didn't know that it was a long distance relationship and there was no sex happening. And these are the days when we still didn't have pop up blockers. And I landed up on a site. One site led to the other. And I saw this woman tied up in very scary at that time, intriguing certainly, but in a scary manner, contorted all around and smiling. And like one of the two things has to be true. Either she has to be smiling or she has to be tied the way she is tied. There's something seriously wrong about that. And I got a little creeped out. I stepped out of the cyber cafe, shut down the PC, stepped out of the cyber cafe, did not go online for the next 15 days. But then curiosity kills the cat. So there I was. I was like, I need to figure this out. दो में से एक चीज हो रही है या तो इसका exploitation हो रहा है or this is something new that I have never understood or known about. And I promised to myself, I said, I'm going to be very cautious. I'm not going to tell anybody anything about me. I'm not going to tell them my name. I'm not going to tell them where I'm from. I'm going to lie about my city. I'll take every precaution that I can, but I need to figure this out. And so I figured it out, but I didn't know what to look for. So again, I tried to trace back my steps from memory. And that's when I first discovered the jargon, the first acronym, which is BDSM. And then onwards, it was Google and Wikipedia. And then there used to be a website called bondage.com at that time. They had something called as the IRC servers. Yahoo groups had shut down. Someone told me about the Yahoo groups in some chat room. And I discovered that the Yahoo groups in India had been shut down. So there was no community, there was only reading stuff for the first year. Entire 2006, it was just reading. 2007, I discovered bondage.com. There was an IRC server. I chatted with people. There were a lot of group role plays. This is all happening on text, okay? There's no image, there's no video, there's no call, none of that. And all these people are either sitting in either UK or US. Those are the two primary places where I interacted with people. They taught me a lot about the concepts and the principles, about what power dynamics look like in relationships, about what dominance can mean in a non BDSM, in a non kink setup. What is the difference between, say, a kinkster and a lifestyler? What is the difference between a garden variety dominant
Please tell us what's the difference between a Kinkster and a
lifestyle?
lifestyle. Did you say that?
I said
A
lifestyler.
lifestyle.
Yeah.
Okay.
So a
Lifestyler.
lifestyler will usually choose BDSM as their way of being in a relationship. A kinkster is somebody who will use kink as a tool to enhance their sexual pleasure in the bedroom. If they are somebody who enjoys being the giver in a certain activity, then they are called a top. If they enjoy receiving a certain activity, then they're called a bottom. So, for instance, if I were a sadist who enjoyed inflicting pain, then I would be a top in a. And so the kinksters have sessions. The lifestylers have sessions and they have activities outside the sessions. And so think of this like somebody being a visiting faculty in a university versus being a tenured professor. A visiting faculty will step in, take an occasional class, take their stipend, go back. On a way, go back. A full time tenured professor is going to be there on the campus taking care of students, and not just in academic ways, but the students might also come up with, "Sir, I can't find a hostel. So, I need a placement, I need a recommendation, I need a reference." So that's the difference. There's a relationship inside the bedroom and there's a relationship outside the bedroom for a lifestyle. For a kinkster, a relationship may or may not exist, but the pleasure in the bedroom will exist. And so these were like a couple of nuances that they sort of talked to me about. And eventually I discovered a few online places where there were people from India, started socializing, met them socially, had coffees with them, spoke to them, discussed stuff. Got a bit of clarity in the cultural context because the cultural context that I had over here was also that you have to stay a virgin till you marry. The cultural context was also like, oh my god, you've got to be the good girl. So there was no
Yeah,
physical
the concept
experience
of the.
all the way till 2010. 2010 is when I first felt ready enough to experiment physically and say to myself that, okay, it's time now because I can't get married to someone as an experiment. I need to know what I want. If I end up wanting kink in a vanilla marriage, then I'm going to ruin two lives. And if I end up wanting vanilla sex after I get married to a kinkster, then also I'm going to ruin up two lives. So I might as well first discover whether I want kink or I don't want kink in the physicalness of the experience. Do I want it on my body? It's great in my head, but does my body really want it? And so that's where the journey started. That's where the experiments and explorations started. It's been a long journey since then.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's a decade that you've been doing, such so much of work actually also on this space, and that's why it's such an honor for me to have you on our show today. So, tell me a little bit about the emotional and psychological intimacy between partners in BDSM.
So there are a couple of answers to that. One is where I would say it's no different from a regular relationship. You are as intimate with your partner as you would be in any other relationship. This is only a different way of expressing that intimacy. This may be a not so mainstream way. This may be a little physically aggressive. This may have activities that are driven by pain. Not all kinksters are into pain. Not everybody is a sadist. Not everybody is a masochist. Not everybody is into bondage. Not everybody likes discipline. So the six terms that you defined, some people may want one of them. Some people may want more than one of them. So the first thing to understand is that not all BDSM is about pain or abuse or hurt. And so the psychological aspect doesn't have to be driven by trauma. The psychological aspect doesn't have to become coming from a place of, oh, you must have undergone something bad when you were a child, and that's the reason why you like this. The second thing to understand is even people who like pain may like it as a physical sensation, just like the gym rats that we see who will like do heavy lifting, and will come back with sore legs and will come back with sore arms, and will still go back and hit the gym the next day and enjoy it. So there's, in that sense, there's not much of a difference. When it comes to the extreme activities, when I say extreme, I'm talking about some things like, say, choking, things like needle play, things like extreme bondage. Those are activities that shouldn't be done lightly. A, that shouldn't be done unless people really trust each other. And they shouldn't be done unless people are very prepared and very medically well appointed, in the sense that they have all their first aid handy, they've been tutored, they've been guided by people who've been doing this for a couple of years. Also, one thing to understand here, Mawa, and I think your readers and sorry, your listeners and viewers, one another thing to understand, Mawa, that your listeners and viewers should really keep in mind is that this is not an endorsement for BDSM. This is not to say that people should engage or shouldn't engage. This is simply to say that if you decide to engage, know what you're getting into and be prepared for it. And that's where the intimacy will actually happen. Because if I can't feel safe around a partner, then there's no intimacy. Then there can be fear, there can be pain, there can be adventurous sensation, but there's no intimacy. Then it's like a drug. All my drinking buddies are not necessarily my friends. If it's only about drinking together, then there's no friendship. If it's only about the hormone rush, then there's no intimacy. The intimacy will come in when there's a lot of communication, when there's a lot of trust, when there are a lot of safe words that are established, when there are a lot of mechanisms and fallback options that are established. When a dominant decides not to cut you off from your support systems, and when there's a sense of people that you can reach out to, when you no longer feel alone in your journey, that's when intimacy actually starts blossoming. Because otherwise, it's a lonely journey. It can be a very lonely journey, and that's not something a lot of people are prepared for.
So, Anupama, what advice would you give to somebody who's very curious about exploring BDSM for the first time?
Okay, so one, start it very slow. There's no hurry. No matter what age you are, no matter how soon or how late you've discovered it. Even if you've discovered it in your 50s, it's all right. So, A, take it slow. Start with the easier, milder, super mild activities. Speak to your partner. Ask them what they like, ask them what they don't like. Now, if you want ideas about, I don't, so sometimes a lot of people begin from a place of, I don't even know what I like and what I don't like. How do I discover that? So there are a couple of checklists available online. There are a couple of websites. Like there's this one website called bdsmtest.org. I think they have a non-profit. They've been running this self-assessment tool for years now. I first used it when I was very new, and we still use it. From time to time, we keep seeing how we've evolved or how we've moved. So there are tools like that available. You can use them to discover things that you may like, may not like, to get ideas. And then the important thing to discuss is the safe calls and the safe words. If you have friends that you can count on who will not necessarily watch but be present in the general vicinity to help you through a tricky situation, say a tricky knot, and you need to get the person out of the bondage instantly. So, how do you go about that? Safe words are more like either of the parties need to call off the session. They need to know what to say, because a no can also mean no, stop, and a no can also mean, oh no, I really like it. No, 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 don't do it. But the idea is still like, I want you to do it, right? So no is a very tricky safe word. So usually we prefer a red, yellow, green. Red meaning just hard stop, stop everything that you're doing. A yellow is like slow down, and a green is like everything's going great. So establish mechanisms like these. Establish boundaries of what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. There are certain things that do not come up in conversations because they can trigger some old memory while in the session. And you need to really be able to read your partner's body and their eyes and their tone and everything else. So the familiarity with your partner's body outside the kink space is equally important. And that familiarity will take time to establish. What else can they do? They can go online on a couple of platforms, talk to people, read what people are writing. Because a lot of people have started journaling a lot and documenting from their lived experiences a lot. There are workshops that have started happening, I think, in India, and there are those options available. So people can join those. And I think that's a good place to start. Jumping into things head on without being prepared is a little risky because the activities involved are high impact and there are higher stakes here. So unless you have the skin in the game, don't play the game. Take your time. Like I took 9 years before I sort of had my first session. Four, no, not 9 years, 4.5 years. But I took 9 years before I got into a first proper BDSM relationship, as I would call it. So you have to take your time.
How do you see the trend of increase of online sale of sex products, impacting societal attitudes towards sexual health and openness about sexual preferences in different regions of India? There is a rise, right? Today, I think there is Muse, I think one company that's all talking a lot about as a dildo, am I right? And there are quite a few other companies also that has done very, very well, like Beshram.com, that sells a lot of products, sexual health products. So, what do you see as a change, and what do you see the future?
So the change is more in terms of acceptance. And I think a lot of that has to do with women being able to express their desires more openly. It's a it's a very woman driven change in some ways. While the spending capacity may be higher when it comes to men, the ability of women to embrace that it's okay to buy a dildo or it's okay to buy a vibrator, that acceptance in itself has caused the game to shift. That's one. There is still, I think, a lot in tier two cities and tier three cities that needs to be explored, and that still remains to be seen in terms of how it will shift. Because, so this is interesting. We're living in interesting times. We're living in very censored times in one way. And at the same time, so there's shadow banning of accounts that's happening. People will talk about sex education and then their account will vanish and they'll be ghosted and all of that will happen. That's one end of things that is happening. On the other hand, we see this trend of rising sales. Like you rightly said, there's Muse and there's IM Shivam, and there are a couple of other platforms that have, you know, worked and are working. We also, I think, have a local manufacturer now. I think Sangya is manufacturing in India. So there's that shift happening, but that shift is still, I see it majorly restricted to tier one cities even today. There is some movement in tier two cities, say like cities like Jaipur or Chandigarh or places like those. But there's still a lot of scope there. I see this increasing for two reasons. As women's purchasing capacity increases, this trend will keep increasing. The second reason I see this increasing is because a lot of people now marry late. And because the age of marriage has shifted, the age of while the age of sexual exploration has reduced, the age of marriage has shifted. So there's a lot of gap between when you start exploring sex and a supposed presupposed societally approved regular supply of sex, and that gap needs to be fulfilled somehow, and that will result in alternate trends like poly, trends like kink, trends like sex toys. Because somewhere or the other, once you've tasted desire, once you've tasted pleasure, you will want it. You will crave for it. Sooner or later, lesser or more, but you'll crave for it in different ways. And as long as the emotional intimacy component is not brought into picture, a sex toy does the job just fine. So the only thing that a sex toy doesn't do is talk to you. There's no pillow talk
Say I
happening.
love you. There is no pillow talk with a sex toy. So, on your Facebook, you mentioned a few lines, hookup gyan. You don't always have to be attracted to nice people, but you must feel safe, even with nasty ones, to hook up safely. You need to elaborate this for us.
So this was happening in a girls' group, and somebody said, "Hey, you know what? I'm feeling very hookup driven," and they discussed a couple of red flags about the person that they were potentially going to be with. And so I said, and she admitted, she acknowledged that she was feeling a little desperate. And I was like, "Why do you think you're feeling a little desperate?" And she was like, "I don't know, but I think I'm ignoring the red flags." And that's where this statement came out of. She was like, "I don't feel like I'm attracted to the nicer people anymore because they're too nice for me." And I was like, "It's not necessary to be attracted to nice people. Nice, being nice is a basic fundamental expectation. You should be nice to everybody. You don't have to be nice to just your sexual partners." And so, because you have to be nice to everybody, or because generally speaking, we should be nice to everybody, it's not necessary to be attracted to a nice person. But in order to have a successful hookup, you need to feel safe irrespective of who that person is. Because if you're not feeling safe, then you'll come back with a trauma. Either you'll inflict trauma or you'll come back with an experience of trauma. And as a woman, as an AFAB, I didn't want her to go through that. And I was like, so dude, feel safe first. They may do nasty things. They may do BDSM. They may probably push your limits. But you have to feel safe enough that they will not violate your limits. Pushing limits and violating limits is very different. And that clarity and that sense of safety and trust has to happen, even if it's a stranger. And if they don't give you that right, then just don't be with them. So that's where the context of that line is. You need to feel safe first. Everything else comes later.
And how does your family deal with all of this about you, Anupama?
I think they just sort of accepted it over time. It wasn't an easy journey, and there was a lot of communication around how would you feel if I got married to someone outside a community? How would you feel if I got married to someone outside our religion? How would you feel if I got married to someone outside this country? How would you feel if I didn't marry at all? How would you feel if I had a child outside of marriage or didn't marry but have a child, a biological child? And then it came to how would you feel if I ended up with a girl? And then the next stage was how would you feel if I ended up with more than one partner? I've never said it to their faces, but they are on my Facebook. They read the stuff that I write. They've asked me about the books, if it's okay for them to read it. I think my siblings might have probably even read it. They've just refrained from commenting because they didn't want to hurt their sister's feelings about the probably the five grammatical errors that they found in my book. But then I think somewhere they've just accepted that this is who I am, this is who I'm going to be. And because it doesn't bother them, because it doesn't cause nuisance for them, I don't find it irresponsible of me to do it after 15 years of having, like I said, I could have lived the duplicitous life. I could have lived the life where I was a fraud, but I didn't want to do that. And when I say fraud, I'm not saying it with a demeaning mindset towards other people who have to live a duplicit life. It's a situation that they might be in. It's a choice that they might make. It's their choice to make. But mine was to reconcile and to be able to live as authentically as possible. And for that, it was very important that my family, my closest friends, and key colleagues in every workplace where I get hired are looped in. Because uh, I don't want my manager to roll his eyes or her eyes at me when I say I was on a date and they ask me with whom, and I end up giving one name and then I end up giving another name, say a week later. I don't want people wondering about what's happening. And if there has to be slut shaming, then it might as well happen in the interview so that I don't end up joining the place in the first place. So, yeah. So the family and friends are pretty cool.
This is so much courage. This is so much of courage, Anupama, to really be authentic to yourself, and especially in an area where in India there is so much of taboo and there is so much of ostracism to talk about sexual health, and for women it's even more higher. So kudos to you, Anupama, and thank you for taking out the time for being on today's podcast. And look forward to meeting up with you in Delhi whenever I come and see you.
Thank you for having me, Mohua. You've been very generous with how you treat me, how you advise me. And I hope your audience is equally generous to both you and me about this particular episode. I'm sure they love you, but I hope they're generous to me as well. And thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Anybody who's authentic, anyone who's authentic is a gem. And yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
To you, our dearest listeners, you can find us on your favorite streaming services: Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, and of course on all other major streaming services. With loads of love, we are The Mohua Show, where we talk ईमानदारी से.